Well, hello there, and welcome to day 53 of A Film A Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And today I am looking at the British romance drama slash thriller, Lady Macbeth. So before I talk about the film in terms of the plot and characters, I've found reading around it quite interesting. The film was developed as part of a collaboration between BFI and BBC Films and was funded, at least partially, by a grant for first-time filmmakers. This was William Oldroyd's first feature film, and it's a real demonstration of what can be done on a real minuscule budget. It's kept very contained, and just there's a lot that can be done with very little, and I think that should be applauded, especially when it comes to independent filmmaking and the balance between ambition and creation and the journey between those two. This is definitely the case of a film that is, for my experience, more a thinker than a feeler. That's to say, this was not a fun sit. This wasn't the kind of film that I watched and went, oh, that was, a fun film that really kept me emotionally stimulated and I felt a lot going through. I actually found the experience quite cold. However, intellectually speaking, I found it quite engaging. And even though I left the film not feeling sympathetic to characters or feeling a sense of tragedy or emotional weight to it, I did then go on to consider the themes, and Helen and I discussed the subtexts and meanings behind the film itself and what it's trying to say. It's based on a 19th century Russian novel by Nikolai Leskov called Lady Macbeth of Minsk District. However, transposing it to Victorian Cumbria, it's interesting to see the easy way that it transitions from one to the other. Now, I don't want to put the film down by saying I didn't emotionally engage with it. There was a lot riding against it, similar to News of the World Yesterday, where I find Victorian dramas quite a difficult... They are not a genre I enjoy. Generally, I think there's something quite insufferable about that kind of the style and the look of a Victorian film. I find it quite draining, with the exception of Dickens' adaptations, but he really has a language of his own, whereas any adaptation or any text that's like, oh, this is an original Victorian set drama, or an adaptation of something that isn't a Dickens from that period, I always go in with a sense of dread, because I dislike the heavy, choked, washed out, drained style of it. The Victorian era is not one that I particularly engage with. And starting this film, I really got that sense. I really did watch this thinking, oh god, this is going to be a incredibly dreary, heavy, bleak film where the visuals are also quite grey and dark and gothic, and it really, really was set out to be something that was not going to work for me. Which is why I was quite surprised, because as I said, though that on some level maybe that's what allowed me to disassociate from it emotionally, I did find the narrative interesting. So Florence Pugh plays a woman who has just got married, although it's immediately indicated that this is a financial based marriage rather than an emotional one. That essentially the implication is that her husband's father has bought her and her land and the land that came with her, and that she is in a loveless, joyless marriage where she is contained to her home, practically imprisoned, and emotionally she has no love between her and her husband. We see scenes of nudity and the implication that sex is going to happen, and yet it doesn't, and you can see the fact that they don't connect, that her husband barely wants to be there, and her husband's father just bullies her into submission. And this is, as you can imagine, very clearly it's depicted and presented very much in a feminist language from a critical standpoint. You're really looking at this from a sort of female oppression point of view. The obvious comparisons to, the Macbeth comparisons are withstanding. I really, particularly in the first act, I got a real sense of Lady Chatterley's lover by way of Handmaid's Tale. Because, as you imagine, the plot then revolves around a love affair that our lead Catherine has with a groomsman played by Cosmo Jarvis. And the way that it's presented is not, as you would imagine, this bodice ripper, charged, practically a Bridgerton style romance. It's very dark, and it's very much the product of almost rebellion against oppression, you might say. Because, frankly, no one in this film is presented in a positive light. You have Alexander, the husband, and his father Boris, who are they are the representations of the worst of men. Like, just the bullying, alienating, practically abusive. They treat women, they treat their husband or daughter-in-law practically like a servant in their own household, who has the sole function of maintaining the house and to produce an heir. And there's something very... It's the heart of misogyny in its barest form. And so what you end up with is the groomsman is actually... Sebastian is not your typical handsome, dashing kind of character who saves our protagonist from her miserable life. He's brutish. He enjoys debasing women. When our lead first meets him, him and some others are emotionally torturing a young servant girl, with the implication that something a lot darker is about to happen. And so he is not a good person, this groomsman, but he is very much the freedom, the expression of freedom that our lead can then have, and rebellion. And even then, the lead herself, as you can imagine, with a film called Lady Macbeth, to both maintain her affair and then further on into the plot, without wanting to go into spoilers, she starts to do some very troubling and criminal and frankly bad things. She starts to do some really make some real dark choices that you immediately know that you as an audience are also not sympathetic towards. And so, as I say, I found it quite alienating to observe. I'm not connecting with any of the characters emotionally, I don't sympathise with them. But as I've said in previous videos, you don't need to sympathise with a character to still want to know how the story plays out. And as I say, it's very much about the metatext and the feminist narrative of it, about the depiction of oppression. Insofar as where The Handmaid's Tale is, of course, a dystopian presentation that explores the oppression of women by the patriarchy in a dystopian sense. This is the more... This poses the question, what does the worst of oppression look like in the real world? And this is very much that case. And to the point where you question, okay, you have Alexander, her husband, and Boris, his father, and it's like, well, why would you have both those characters? And what you realise is that Boris, her father-in-law, is more a representation of the overall patriarchy. And that there's something about his character that he is not a happy man. There is something incredibly dark and grim about him, and he bullies everyone. Not just women, not just Catherine or the servant girl, but also his own son and even the groomsman Sebastian. And that he really wants to oppress everyone, and the only thing that matters to him is maintaining the status quo and the control that he has over everyone. And then you have his son, and his son really represents, because there is a certain level of tragedy to the character of Alexander, where he is just as much oppressed by his father as Catherine is, and that he is a victim of circumstance because of choices. As I say, I don't want to spoil too much about the later plot, but there are choices that he's made in his life that have resulted in why he is married to her. And it's very much a case that he represents the sort of disassociated man, the one who benefits from the system but doesn't necessarily revel in it. He is just as much trapped in the system. There's something interesting that as we discussed it, I began to unpack, because there are really 4 male characters in it, each of different ages. So I began to imagine it from a feminist, or you could say gender-flipped version of the Snow White principle. That's to say that Snow White has 3 stages. As you interpret it, you have the young girl who's innocent and carefree and sort of loving. You have the older queen, the sort of beautiful woman who clings onto power, and then you have the aged hag who simply wants to corrupt the things that are beautiful. And so what Lady Macbeth has in reverse to that is there are 4 lead male characters, you might say. There is a young boy, and he very much represents the sweetness of a child. But then as you go through the stages, you see almost like the corrupting influence of toxic masculinity as it breaks from stage to stage to stage. So you go from the young boy, then you have the groomsman, who is the wild man who's obsessed with sex and ways that he can enjoy himself in whatever way possible, and there's something rough but also quite powerful about him, virile, you might say. But then you have the older man who is now under sort of the oppression of the system and has responsibility and expectations upon him, and because of choices he made, he is now just that bit more bitter and disassociated and alienated from the world around him, and really doesn't want to engage with anything. And then you have the old man, the bitter man, who now resents the world and simply wants to cling on to the power that he's established whilst also oppressing everyone around him. And I really found that quite a powerful four-stage breakdown. Although you could argue that you see that in reverse. You see it from almost going backwards, the oldest man through to the youngest boy. So like I say, in that respect, it is quite a thoughtful and interesting film. As I say, when I say a feminist narrative film, I should also clarify that, as I mentioned earlier, the main character is not sympathetic. You're not supposed to think, oh, what she is doing is correct. However, it's almost a representation of apathy. That we as an audience, you know, if she represents sort of the oppressed woman generally, you understand why she makes the choices she does, from the affair to covering it up to then later darker choices, and you understand why the system that has been created around her is changing her into something, well, Lady Macbeth-like, let's say. And I think that's a really interesting thesis on the worst of the realist worst of the patriarchal system. I do think, from that respect, this film is academically very interesting, and I think there are lots of interpretations beyond that. There's an entire racial subtext that really you could explore in it, but to do that, unfortunately, I'd have to spoil it, and I really don't think I should, because I do recommend watching this film. As I say, engaging with it emotionally, I didn't. Other people might. I do think Florence Pugh gives a fantastic performance. You really see that sense of ability in her to express without externalizing, and the fact that she's making choices in her mind and suffering in silence in a way that I think takes a very powerful performer. And as I say, it's a thinker of a film, and I do think intellectually it is very interesting, and it is one to go away and discuss and write about. So take what you will from that, whether that would entice you to it or not, but I'm definitely going away with something from the experience. Anyway, take care. I'll see you tomorrow.